one of the very common questions that is being asked by those who do not believe in God, those who have nothing to do with Christianity, is that why is it that there are far too many different groups, different churches, different leaders? Why can't you all be one? And that is a very valid and very logical question as against the teachings of our blessed Savior. My dear friends, one of the 21st century very well-known church historian, Hank Hanegraaff, he says that if you go to the very beginning of the church, in fact, he says for the first 1,000 years, roughly, in the history of the church, there was one thing that united all the people of God on the face of the earth. That was the sacrament of Eucharist, believing in the bread and wine as Jesus' body and blood. There were no churches, there were no cathedrals, there were not very many liturgical norms, but they all accepted the presence of Jesus in the Eucharist. He says, up till the year 367, until the time of St. Athanasius, there was not even the Bible that we have as Old Testament and New Testament codified together and formalized and accepted as one book. So there was only the Eucharist. For all of them, there was this belief, this faith that this body and this blood is exactly what Jesus wanted all of them to celebrate and acknowledge the presence of God within themselves, so that the presence of the divinity was also in the community. My dear friends, how did we lose this sense of the presence of God in everything that God has created, and also the presence of God in every human person? How did this happen to us? Now, the church historians say that the Western Church made a massive mistake of course, after the schism, when the Western Church and the Eastern churches separated their ways, parted their ways. The Western Church believed in scholastic philosophy, scholastic theology, and they went into all kinds of rational explanations of the sacrament of Eucharist. But they also say the Eastern churches never wanted to rationalize the mystery. They didn't want to explain the mystery of the Eucharist. They just accepted as it was mentioned by Jesus Christ. And they kept that mysticism in the sacrament of Eucharist. So therefore, what the theologians suggest today is that we as people have to go back to the original mysticism of the sacrament of Eucharist, which will bring us all together into oneness of our faith, oneness of our community, because it is the Eucharist that was bringing people together, and it is always, and it will always be, the faith in the Eucharist that will keep us from the depth of our inner souls, both as individuals and as communities, as one church and one community of believers. Father Richard Rohr, one of the great theologians of the modern world from the United States, he says, what we lack today is the capacity that Jesus had in being connected to everything in the world, as he calls it, from the subject within me to the subject within the other person. Now, when he explains that, he says, when Jesus was alive, he had this unitive consciousness. When he explains that, he says, Jesus had developed that unitive consciousness. That is, when he saw water at the feast of Cana, he was able to see wine in that water. He not only saw water, but he saw wine. And therefore he said, this is now for you to enjoy at the wedding. And also in the life of Jesus, when he saw Peter from within the subject where he's within himself, and he saw this man who was impulsive, he was getting angry, he saw a rock inside of him. So that is what from the subject within himself, he saw the subject within Peter. And in that unity of consciousness, when he had his Last Supper, Jesus took bread and he said, "This is my body." So for him, it is not just a symbol, it is not just a bread, but it was his body. For him, he developed that unity of consciousness, being able to connect with everything that God has created in that depth of his being and be consciously connected with the body and his blood, and also be consciously connected with that host and wine and identify both and see them as one. That is why real presence in the Eucharist is something that is very uniquely important for all of us to come together in the mysticism that brings Christianity together, in the mysticism that is experiential for us. Nothing else would be able to make us become one community, one people of God, as some of the theologians in the world uphold today.